You didn't receive this message by accident. The universe, however you name that guiding, synchronizing intelligence inside and around you, sent it because you are standing at the edge of a life-changing threshold, and something inside you crossed that line long before your mind could catch up. You may have felt it as a subtle loosening, a quiet prelude that unsettled everything that previously felt secure. Or maybe it arrived as a series of small, undeniable nudges, a dream that wouldn't let go, a face in a crowd that meant nothing, and then everything, the sudden collapse of a plan you had been sure would last a lifetime. If this resonates, type one line in the comments: "I was awakened before the transition." Let that small act be a tiny ritual, optional, anonymous if you prefer, but a way of anchoring what you're beginning to see. There is timing in this, not random timing, not cruel timing, but functional timing. The larger field, the currents that move through culture, consciousness, and the subtle networks between people, is shifting. Major transitions do not happen in a single explosive moment. They unfurl like an ocean tide, first feeling as a distant, patient swell. Your awakening came ahead of the visible change because the field needed points of coherence to hold place while the shift took shape. Think of you as a lighthouse lit before the fog rolls in. Your light isn't there to save everyone instantly, but to offer a stable beam that reduces confusion, guides a few vessels, and holds a pattern of clarity until more lights can come online. This is not a reward for suffering, nor is it an indication that you are morally superior. You may well have walked through pain to become more open, but pain is not the currency of worth. Rather, you were available, emotionally, energetically, relationally, in a way that allowed your nervous system and heart to adapt earlier. When the system requires stabilizers, it tends toward those whose inner work and sensitivity align with holding that stabilization. You were available, and so you were ready to receive this sequence of recalibration. The internal map of this pre-transition awakening often follows a recognizable arc. If you trace your experience backward, you might see these phases unfolding like a seam being slowly unstitched. First, restlessness, then detachment, then a sharpening of intuition, followed by a steady shedding of old identity, and finally the creeping, patient work of integration. None of these stages necessarily followed in neat order. Some overlapped, some circled back, and some repeated like an echo. But most people who stand where you now stand will recognize at least some of these movements. Restlessness arrives like an itch under the skin of everyday life. It doesn't always announce itself grandly. Sometimes it's a low-grade dissatisfaction that makes previously satisfying routines feel hollow. You may have found yourself moving through obligations with admirable competence, but behind that competence there was a persistent, restless question: is this all? The restlessness is a friend in disguise. It is the system's signal that the internal landscape is no longer compatible with the same external narrative you once inhabited. It is the first tremor before a larger energetic realignment. Detachment follows restlessness with a curious gentleness. What once anchored you begins to feel lighter. Roles you latched onto for identity, titles, labels, relationships, the familiar defenses may lose their grip. You might not have declared a dramatic renunciation. Sometimes detachment shows up as boredom with what used to excite you, or a thinning of tolerance for certain people, conversations, and habits. This drift isn't an act of rebellion so much as an internal reprioritization. The inner compass is recalibrating toward what is essential and away from what is purely habitual. Then your intuition starts to sharpen, not in a flashy, clairvoyant way necessarily, but as a heightened sense of knowing about small, practical things. You may catch yourself anticipating how conversations will go, or finding that you understand someone's state before they speak. There are moments when a single gesture or tone tells you more than pages of explanation. This is not evidence of mystical superiority. It is evidence that your attention has reorganized. You are tuning in to subtler frequencies, emotional cues, energetic shifts, patterns that previously blurred into noise. As your inner instruments refine, the world begins to answer more distinctly. Shedding is the messy, often tender labor following detachment. Old assumptions pry loose. Defenses unravel. A job, a friendship, or a place that anchored you can fall away not because you chose a dramatic exit, but because the context subtly ceases to support who you are becoming. This shedding can be sorrowful, sometimes abrupt, and sometimes strangely liberating. Expect complexity. Relief and grief can live in the same breath. Know that letting go is not failure. It is the system making room for a different structural integrity. You are unburdening what no longer fits so that what is true to you has space to grow. Integration is the slow artistry that follows shedding. It is the work of making the inner shifts steadier and translating them into daily life. Integration is rehearsal, small acts of aligning speech with feeling, choosing boundaries that reflect who you are becoming, cultivating rhythms that sustain rather than drain you. This stage resists glamour because its currency is consistency. Integration does not demand perfection, it asks for patience and tender attention. As you gather these small practices, something happens. A coherence forms within you that subtly changes how the world responds. What you may have noticed alongside these inner movements are external rearrangements that feel like replies rather than coincidences. The universe, understood as a synchronizing intelligence, often mirrors internal frequency shifts by shifting external conditions. You may have experienced a string of synchronicities so precise they felt like choreography. Perhaps a song played at the exact moment you needed it. An unexpected message opened a door you had stopped knocking on. Or a conversation with a stranger redirected your trajectory. These are not guaranteed or magical in a formulaic sense. They are the field's way of reflecting resonance. When your inner frequency changes, the field sometimes reorganizes to match that coherency. Relationships often act as the clearest mirror of change. People who anchored your old identity can drift away, not always out of ill will, but because the resonance that held you together has shifted. This isn't always loss in the tragic sense. Sometimes it is a necessary unclasping that frees both parties to find more authentic alignments. Other relationships deepen in unexpected ways. Allies appear like scattered ships finding the same current. You may meet someone whose presence feels like a confirmation, or you may find an old friend re-emerging with new eyes. These movements in the outer world are informative but not prescriptive. They are data points, not moral judgments. Another sign you might recognize is the rearrangement of circumstance. Doors that once seemed closed now open with startling ease, while long-cherished plans dissolve without drama. Jobs change, living situations shift, creative impulses surface. These changes can be disorienting if you expected linear progress. Instead, see them as the field making space. When your inner coherence reaches a certain threshold, the external network becomes more responsive, not because you deserve special favors, but because resonance acts like a magnet. It attracts configurations that match its pattern. Sensory sensitivity often increases. You might find yourself more reactive to noise, light, or crowded environments, or more attuned to subtle emotional atmospheres. For some, this means needing more rest and boundary setting. For others, it requires learning new ways to process sensations. This heightened sensitivity is not a pathology. It is a feature of being tuned to a finer frequency. It demands compassion toward yourself and others, and practical adjustments that honor the new bandwidth you're operating within. Throughout this inner and outer choreography, small synchronies compound. Once, a single coincidence might have felt like fluke. Now, patterns emerge. You notice numbers repeating, themes returning across different contexts, and people appearing at exactly the moment when a piece of inner work calls for human presence. These patterns are not evidence of cosmic favoritism. They are indications that you're operating in a system that responds to coherence with coherence. When your internal state settles into a clear posture, the field increasingly mirrors that posture back to you. It is important to name a practical ethic for how you embody this awakening. You are not here to rescue others or carry the burden of their process. The shift you hold is influenced by presence, not imposition by prescription. Your clarity operates like a lighthouse. It offers a steady beam that others may orient toward, but it does not drag vessels safely to shore. Presence invites resonance, it doesn't coerce transformation. This is a crucial boundary to maintain because the temptation to fix outcomes can be strong when you see possibilities that others do not yet perceive. Hold the posture of offering steadiness and example, not carrying responsibility for the spiritual outcomes of others. Because this role can be misunderstood, let me be explicit. Your value is not in utility alone. You are not valuable solely because you stabilize the field. Your worth is inherent, and the stabilizer function is simply a manifestation of how your gift meets the moment. Treat yourself kindly when you do the unseen labor of holding steadiness. Often this labor goes unrecognized. It may feel lonely at times, and that loneliness isn't a deficiency. It's the necessary solitude for recalibration. Yet the solitude should not become isolation. Integration is best practiced within a web of healthy connection. Seek communities, small, trusted circles, where you can rest without performance and practice coherence without the need to explain everything. There is an energetic grammar to how your presence influences the collective. Think of coherence as a field property. When you cultivate inner alignment, consistency between feeling, intention, and action, you emit a steady frequency. That frequency is legible to people who are sensitive or ready to attune. It creates a safe point in the field. Others may unconsciously gravitate toward that safety. They may relax, follow, or be inspired. But they will also retain agency. Your coherence nudges the field. It does not overwrite free will. Your steadiness becomes an invitation rather than a command. If you have been wondering whether the universe chose you, it can feel that way, and feeling chosen is a valid part of your experience. Yet it's more accurate and more kind to frame it as an availability and alignment. You were awake early because your system had developed capacities, curiosity, resilience, openness that allowed you to adapt ahead of a broader recalibration. This does not imply exclusivity. As the tides shift, many more will awaken and the network will thicken. Your early presence is not an exclusive membership card. It's a functional role that will be joined by others. You may be asking, what happens next? It helps to understand that the threshold you are approaching is less a single dramatic event and more a series of inflection points. There are moments when a new baseline becomes visible, longer stretches of inner peace, fewer spikes of dissonance, a clearer guiding intuition. You don't have to prepare by mastering grand rituals. The preparatory work is intimate and steady, tending to sleep, refining boundaries, choosing practices that restore nervous system regulation, keeping your word to yourself, and creating small pockets of ritual that anchor you. Ritual can be simple and symbolic. A brief morning declaration, an evening gratitude practice, a walk in silence. These are not magical shortcuts. They are training for coherence. They teach your nervous system and heart to recognize and hold a particular frequency. Over time, those small practices have cumulative effects. They create seams of continuity that allow you to move through social environments without fragmenting into reactive patterns. Rituals also give you a vocabulary of meaning that resists the confusion of major transitions. When the world rearranges, rituals are reference points. You might find intermittent surges of clarity that feel like test runs of the new baseline. There could be days when everything moves easily and your intuition is sharp, followed by stretches where old uncertainties reassert themselves. This is normal. Integration is not linear. Think of it as seasons within a larger year rather than a single sunrise. Be patient with the back and forth. Each oscillation is an opportunity to practice the poise you wish to make habitual. As your inner field stabilizes, your choices start to carry different weight. Small acts, a calm response to provocation, a clear boundary, a moment of generosity can ripple farther than before. This is not because you suddenly have more power. It's because the field you emit is less reactive and more coherent, and coherence amplifies subtle influences. You begin, almost imperceptibly, to contribute to a new pattern in the world simply by living from your aligned center. The paradox is simple. The quieter and more centered you become, the more far-reaching your impact often is. There will be practical tests. Life will continue to require navigation in relationships, finances, health, and practical responsibilities. Awakening is not an escape from ordinary life. It's a recontextualization of how you engage with ordinary life. The difference is that the energies you bring to decisions shift from reactive survival to intentional responsiveness. This does not guarantee smooth sailing, but it changes what smoothness means, less about convenience and more about integrity. Sometimes the field's responsivity takes the form of unusual opportunities. You might encounter work that fits in unexpectedly precise ways, or find yourself called to a project with timing that feels uncanny. Treat these moments with curiosity rather than entitlement. The field conspires with coherence, but it does not pay debts. Opportunity aligned with presence, and how you meet those opportunities is as important as the opportunity itself. Remember that alignment is not a one-time event, it is an ongoing practice. How you show up after the opportunity arrives is what integrates it sustainably. Other times, the field responds with refinement rather than reward. Relationships that were comfortable but not nourishing move into new configurations, or geographic and lifestyle shifts present themselves as invitations to simplify. These are not punishments, they are calls to congruence. You may be asked to let go of roles that have served you well but no longer reflect who you are becoming. Such transitions can be tender and require support. Do not expect to do the integration alone. Seek mentors, friends, coaches, or therapists who respect the spiritual dimension without denying the psychological and practical realities. One of the most delicate aspects of this stage is learning to hold influence gently. Being an anchor does not mean being stoic or detached from empathy. On the contrary, your capacity to feel deeply and remain calm is what makes your steadiness trustworthy. People will test the anchor in varied ways, sometimes with criticism, sometimes with projection, sometimes with fear. Practice compassion that recognizes the limits of what you can do for another. You can offer language, presence, and an example. Beyond that, each person is responsible for their own process. This ethical boundary keeps your energy from being sapped by rescue dynamics. You'll discover secret allies along the way, strangers who mirror your values, old friends who re-emerge with new eyes, and scattered individuals whose small acts of kindness feel like conscious signposts. These are the co-arising nodes in the network you're helping to stabilize. Their presence is neither miraculous nor trivial. It is part of the natural self-organization of the field. Pay attention to these alliances. They are the seedlings of the broader community that will grow as the transition continues. If doubt creeps in, and doubt will because you are human, treat it as data rather than verdict. Doubt raises questions that require honest answering. Are you overestimating the shift? Are you retreating into illusion? Resist the urge to use doubt as an excuse to abandon the work. There is a disciplined curiosity you can apply. Test your assumptions. Keep a log of patterns. Notice whether the moments of clarity persist and multiply. Patterns over time give better information than dramatic moments of either clarity or confusion. There is also an inner politics to manage. As your inner boundaries firm, you may discover that your relationship to authority, internalized or external, changes. You are less likely to accept inherited scripts without interrogation. This can create friction in family systems, workplaces, and social circles that prefer the status quo. Expect to make hard, compassionate choices about where to invest your presence. You do not owe everyone your explanation. Clarity about where you spend emotional labor preserves your capacity to be present where it matters. And remember tenderness. Part of the recalibration is learning to be both fierce and soft. Fierce in the sense of protecting your integrity and commitments. Soft in the sense of tending to the vulnerable parts that surface when old identities dissolve. You will surprise yourself with how much courage the new life asks for. Not always dramatic heroism, but quiet bravery. Choosing the smaller truth in conversations, staying with grief without numbing, being honest about capacity, and honoring rest when the system asks for it. As you move deeper into this process, the texture of meaning shifts. Questions that once commanded your attention, "What will I become?" or "How will I be seen?" are replaced by more refined inquiries. How does my presence change the field around me? And which small acts today will sustain coherence tomorrow? These questions are operational rather than speculative. They direct you toward daily habits that matter: sleep hygiene, nervous system regulation, honest communication, skillful boundary setting, and the tiny rituals that remind you of your center. There is also a growing appreciation for the ordinary sacred, the ceremonial quality of pouring your morning tea, the reverence in a deep breath before speaking, the prayerful attention to a task done well. The threshold you are approaching is not only about dramatic outer shifts. It's about a recalibration of meaning where the sacred is found in everyday fidelity. This reorientation is powerful because it democratizes the spiritual life. You don't need to be spectacular to be significant. The quiet, consistent choices you make matter precisely because they are quiet and consistent. If you sense impatience, a rush to cross the threshold, welcome that feeling without capitulating to urgency. Thresholds are not turned on by pushing. They are crossed by readiness. Readiness is not frantic action. It's a composed alignment. Your inner nervous system must be resourced enough to hold a new baseline. That requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to practice containment. The world will invite you into haste. Practice the countercultural art of measured presence. As you practice presence, notice how your inner language changes. The stories you tell about yourself may become shorter, truer, and less defensive. Old narratives about scarcity, lack, or unworthiness may surface as reflexes. When they do, note them without annihilation. Rewriting storylines is not about erasing the past. It's about integrating the lessons and freeing up energy previously bound to defense.
This is the alchemy of maturation. Grief transforms into steady fuel for purpose. If you have feared that you must publish a perfect identity for the world to accept, let that fear soften. The field values authenticity more than perfection. Your nervous system's capacity to show up honestly, to reveal imperfect humanity while maintaining coherence, is deeply magnetic. People are hungry for exemplars who are not flawless but honest. Your willingness to be human while holding a consistent practice invites others to do the same. Tonight, in the silence before sleep, you might find yourself rehearsing what it feels like to stand on the threshold. There is a particular hush in that rehearsal, an anticipatory stillness that feels like breath held at the base of a dive. This hush is important. It is not empty, it is full of readiness. You can practice entering that hush during the day. A 1-minute pause before answering a text. A 3 deep breath ritual when frustration rises. A short grounding walk after a heavy conversation. These mini thresholds teach you to cross more steadily when the larger moments arrive. Sooner than you expect, the field will test the coherence you've been cultivating. A demand for immediate reaction may appear, a provocation, a crisis, a sudden chart change in finances or relationships. When that test arrives, the quality of your presence will be the lever. You will have cultivated muscles of containment, and they will be called. The call will not be to perform, but to demonstrate steadiness. How you respond will matter less for what it changes immediately and more for what pattern it reinforces in the field. Before that test arrives, there are practical anchors to consider. Choose small practices that consistently return you to center. A nightly check-in with yourself, a regular movement practice, a trusted friend who sees you without agenda, and a short verbal declaration you repeat when doubt crowds in. These anchors are not magical incantations, they are scaffolding. They give the nervous system a vocabulary for coherence. There is also an invitation to cultivate curiosity about your dreams and inner imagery. For many people in this phase, dreams carry symbolic signals that accelerate integration. Keep a small notebook by your bed. Notice recurrent themes, colors, or images. Dreams often compress long, complex processes into a single potent symbol. Treat them as data and possibility rather than prophecy. They can be wise allies in your integration work. You may be tempted to announce your newfound clarity loudly. There will be moments when the impulse to teach, explain, or evangelize feels strong. Resist the compulsion to make your internal restructuring into external doctrine. Influence grows quietly through example, steady practice, and lived ethics. When you must speak, prefer invitation over persuasion. Say less, mean more, and allow the field to do its subtle organizing work.
There is a practical rhythm emerging in people who function well as early stabilizers. They alternate between focused periods of action and generous stretches of rest. This rhythm is not indulgence, it is sustainability. The field will test your endurance and your capacity to remain available without burning out. The pattern that supports longevity is work with attention, rest with intention, and be social with discernment. Honor the restorative needs of your body and nervous system as sacred parts of your contribution. You will probably need to relearn productivity framed by depth rather than output. In a culture that often measures success by visible achievement, the quiet labor of holding coherence can feel invisible. Keep a private ledger of small, meaningful metrics: days you maintained a practice, moments you chose presence over reactivity, pieces of writing you finished, relationships you repaired. These private measures anchor you when external measures do not reflect your inner transformations. And finally, for this section, remember community as a slow-growing infrastructure. Seek connection with individuals who model emotional maturity, who can witness your process without trying to rescue it. Tiny communities of mutual accountability, people who ask you how you are integrating and then hold the space for the answer, will become essential. These networks are not broad social media platforms. They are small clusters where depth is possible. Invest in them deliberately. At this point in the narrative, you've seen what brought you here: the inner tremors, the quiet dismantling, the sharpening of perception, the modest ritual practices, and the external reorganizations that confirm a shift. You've also begun to understand the ethic of being a stabilizer, influence by presence, not imposition, and the practical scaffolding that helps you sustain that role. Ahead lies the activation phase and a deeper articulation of how your presence contributes to the collective pattern as more people wake. There are tests coming, invitations to step into new forms of contribution, and precise practices that will help you anchor beyond the private ritual into public, sustainable action. There will also be temptations and pitfalls, the urge to over-identify with the role, the pressure to perform, and the risk of confusing external acclaim with internal coherence. As you stand with one foot past the inner threshold and one foot still in the familiar terrain, notice the quality of your breath. There is a particular clarity at this edge, not the clarity of certainty, but the clarity of readiness. This readiness is what the field has been aligning to. It is not an achievement to boast about, it is a posture to cultivate. In the next phase, we'll explore how activation looks in the world: subtle gestures that ripple outward, ethical boundaries that preserve potency, and the symbolic declarations that can help consolidate both personal and collective readiness. For now, rest in the knowledge that you were not too early and not too late. You arrived in time to be useful, to stabilize, and to help shape what comes next simply by committing to keep aligning. When the moment for more visible action arrives, you will recognize it by its quiet insistence, a gentle opening that matches the pattern you've been practicing. Until then, continue the small acts of coherence,
Notice the field's echoes and tend to your own steady light. Sooner or later, activation will feel less like an event and more like a refinement, a series of small choices that confirm your readiness. The call does not always sound like thunder. It often appears as a soft aligning of opportunities with capacity, a doorway that opens because you have learned to stand quietly at its frame. When that doorway appears, you will know it by how different choices feel: steadier, less reactive, more measured. The difference is not theatrical. It's an interior economy that taxes you less and borrows less from fear. Expect practical invitations before public ones. You might be asked to hold a difficult conversation with clarity instead of avoiding it. You might be offered a project that requires less ego and more service. You could find yourself in a group where people look to you for a steady tone rather than for answers. These moments are not always glamorous. Their currency is ordinary reliability, showing up on time, keeping your commitments, speaking with honesty and brevity. This is where your early stabilizing work pays off. Your alignment matters not because it impresses others, but because it makes the system around you less chaotic. When the field offers a visible opening, test it slowly. Activation favors discernment over haste. Before accepting a public role, a leadership position, or a project that amplifies your voice, ask simple questions to yourself. Is this aligned with the small daily practices that sustain you? Does this invitation ask for more than your current capacity can offer without depletion? Who will benefit and in what ways? These are not moral litmus tests, but practical checks that preserve continuity. Saying yes from scarcity, guilt, or the desire for validation undoes the very pattern you have been building. The world will tempt you with applause and status. This is one of the softer traps: identification with being needed. When people begin to rely on the steadiness you provide, it is easy to conflate usefulness with identity. Watch for signs of over-identification: exhaustion masked as duty, defensiveness when criticized, or a shrinking of personal boundaries in the name of service. Maintain the rule: influence is never a currency for self-definition. Your value predates your usefulness. Let this understanding be a tether. It will keep your contributions sustainable and your private life intact. There will also be tests that deliberately unsettle you. Crisis is the laboratory for integration. A sudden relational rupture, financial wobble, or health snag may arrive as a measurement of how integrated your coherence truly is. These are not punishments, they are revealing moments. How you respond in a destabilizing situation reveals what has actually changed inside you. Do you default to old scripts, or can you inhabit steadiness while holding honest feeling? Practicing this in smaller, everyday instances prepares you for larger trials. One effective practice for tests is to slow time internally. When provoked, aim to lengthen the space between stimulus and response. That pause is not a moralizing silence. It is an ethical field in which clarity can be born. Use small, repeatable anchors in those pauses. 3 breaths that land attention in your heart, naming the feeling in one word, or a micro-habit like placing your hand on your chest for a count. These are not dramatic rituals. They are shorthand that remind your nervous system of its capacity to hold breath. As you move toward public expression, curating your language becomes part of the craft. Speak less about conclusions and more about process. Share what you have tested rather than what you assume. Offer invitations rather than prescriptions. This humility carries weight. People respond more readily to a presence that models inquiry over certainty. When you do offer guidance, make clear the boundary. What you share helped you, it may help others, but it is not the only path. This stance preserves the dignity of those around you and prevents the subtle slide into dogma. Ethical proximity matters. You will encounter people who are hungry for consolation, validation, or direction. Discernment about how close to let others into your inner work is essential. There is a difference between mentorship and dependency. A mentor invites autonomy. A rescuer unconsciously fosters dependency. Your role as an early stabilizer is to exemplify sovereignty.
To make clear how you maintain your balance and to show pathways for others to cultivate their own steadiness. Encourage inquiry, not surrender. Activation also involves scaling practices in a way that respects limits. If your private rituals are the foundation, consider which of them can hold a public contour. Perhaps your morning pause can be shared as a simple community practice, or your journal prompt adapted for a small group. The risk is turning ritual into performance. Keep offerings modest, repeatable, and optional. When a practice is marketed as a panacea, the field tends to fracture. Offer tools that empower others to do their own work, and be wary of anything that binds people to you as the sole resource. There are moments of subtle arrogance that can creep in when external validation accumulates. It is a quiet temptation to assume you know better than others, or to discount their readiness because you see patterns they do not. Cultivate a soft humility. Keep returning to the inner metrics that matter: personal integrity, capacity to rest, and the presence of curiosity. When praise escalates, let it be data, not identity. Applause can be nourishing. It should not become a new nervous system architecture that requires constant refueling. Practical support systems are essential. You will need people who can give honest feedback, mirror blind spots, and hold you warmly without rescuing. Seek peers who do their own integration work. Find mentors who are seasoned in both interior practice and worldly navigation. Professional support, therapy, somatic coaching, mentorship is not evidence of weakness. It's infrastructure. When you carry responsibility for steadying a field, your energy is a resource that must be replenished and refined. Pay attention to the language you use internally. The inner narrator that once insisted on scarcity or judgment will attempt familiar scripts. When those narratives surface, practice a gentle editorial stance. Replace catastrophic pronouncements with curious questions. Instead of "I must never fail," try "What might failure teach me?" Instead of "They will abandon me if I'm not perfect," try "Who in my life knows me enough to witness my limits with compassion?" Language is not mere rhetoric. It shapes feeling and behavior. Small shifts in inner speech accumulate into a different way of being. As activation continues, you will notice your capacity for discernment expands. Opportunities that once felt enticing may no longer land in your nervous system as aligned. This is a legitimate pruning process. The network that forms around you will be less about size and more about depth. You may find pleasure in fewer relationships, but of richer quality. Your sphere becomes less horizontal, broad and shallow, and more vertical, narrow and deep. This is not a loss of generosity, it's a reallocation of your energetic investment. There is wisdom in creating readable markers for your own growth. Consider keeping a coherence journal, a simple log where you note days when your practice is held, times when you felt scattered and what preceded it, and small victories of returning to center. Over months, patterns will appear. These entries become a form of testimony, not for public consumption, but as personal evidence of progress. Patterns, more than singular mystical experiences, are the reliable indicators of genuine change. Rituals that move beyond the private into collective life can be powerful when done with intentionality. Small circles that begin with a minute of silence, followed by a reading or a shared breath, operate like communal anchors. They are not mass events. Think micro-communities where depth is possible. These circles do not need doctrine. They need consistency, confidentiality, and a capacity for emotional safety. When the collective rhythm begins to shift, such small gatherings become nodes of sustained coherence. When you do step into visible work, remember to steward feedback. Not all responses will be flattering. Some will be blunt, some will misunderstand. Let critique be a tool rather than a wound. Distinguish between feedback that is informative and attacks that are projections. When criticism lands, ask, "Does this point offer a window into my blind spot? If so, welcome it." If it is a projection of someone else's struggle, compassion is the appropriate response, not defensive correction. There will be external narratives that try to reduce your experience to slogans. Resist the lure of easy explanations. Complexity is a friend here. Your path may involve contradictions, fierce boundary making and radical compassion, deep rest and decisive action. Holding paradox without collapsing into cynicism is a hallmark of the mature stabilizer. Celebrate nuance, teach nuance, live nuance. As the network thickens, you will see emergent patterns that are neither wholly yours nor wholly the field's. They are co-creations. Projects that feel like extensions of your integrity will arise, not because you sought them aggressively, but because coherence attracts opportunity. When co-creation emerges, clarify roles early. Agreements about time, emotional labor, and boundaries prevent mission creep and protect the relational ecology of the work. Collaboration is generous, but not without contracts. There will be moments when you must bow out of a contribution. Withdrawal is not always a sign of failure. Sometimes it is the wisest act of integrity. Leaving a role because it demands unsustainable energy preserves your capacity to serve elsewhere and models a healthy limit to others. Decide to step back with grace rather than abruptness when possible. Offer transition plans, recommend replacements, and leave space for continuity. Grief is an inevitable companion in this work. You will grieve the versions of yourself that recede, the relationships that no longer align, and the comfortable certainties that dissolve. Allow grief its due. It deserves language, ritual, and witnesses. Grief is not a detour from awakening, it is an integral strand. It signifies attachment loosening, which creates room for emergent meaning. Treat grief as an honest teacher who is clearing what is no longer useful. Joy will also expand in forms you may not expect. The taste of a shared silence, an email that expresses genuine gratitude without praise-seeking, a simple meal that tastes like presence. These become luminous. Delight in small things becomes a form of resistance to the belief that significance requires spectacle. Celebrate micro-joys. They will sustain you when the broader work feels heavy.
If you are moved to create offerings, writing, teaching, art, or gatherings, consider framing them as invitations to practice rather than as destinations. Language like, a practice for cultivating steadiness, invites participation without promising transformation. Encourage experimentation and iteration. Share failures honestly alongside successes. When you normalize the messy middle of development, you create a safer field for others to engage their own work. As activation deepens, your relationship to time may shift. You might find patience grows in you, not as resignation, but as a steady acceptance of pace. There is a different tempo at which this kind of change reliably thrives. Not rushed, not languid, but rhythmic. Aligning to that tempo is a quiet discipline. Resist the cultural suggestion that speed equals progress. Some of the most durable changes happen slowly, accruing like sediment that later builds an unshakable foundation. Offerings that scale while preserving intimacy require systems. If you intend to share your practices widely, design structures that maintain personal touch, small cohorts, recurring office hours, apprenticeships, or mentorship circles. Technology can help, but beware of replacing human proximity with digital spectacle. The field you influence is sustained by relationships. Systems that economize attention protect the relational quality of your work. As you steward influence, honor the power of saying no. It is one of the most radical acts of service. No is a form of boundary that preserves yes. Practicing refusal with kindness prevents overcommitment and models healthy limits for those around you. Teach others that saying no can be an act of clarity rather than an offense. There will be moments where you must make ethical decisions that have ripple effects. When such choices arise, center 3 pragmatic questions. Who benefits? Who might be harmed? What aligns with the integrity I am cultivating? Let these guide rather than ideology. Ethical clarity is not about moral perfection. It is about consciously choosing the frame through which your actions operate. You may worry about becoming rigid, that steadfastness will calcify into dogmatism. Guard against this by staying curiously engaged with life. Read widely, listen humbly, and keep practices that facilitate openness, such as movement, creative play, and exposure to different perspectives. Flexibility is not compromise. It is the capacity to integrate new data without losing your center. At some point, you may encounter someone who claims that your early awakening was their idea, or who tries to co-opt in language for another agenda. These appropriations are both a compliment and a challenge. They show the field is noticing, but they also test your capacity to hold boundaries with clarity. Respond with neutral, factual language when needed, and focus on your own practice rather than policing narratives at scale.
Your integrity will outlast opportunistic appropriations. Now, about the symbolic act that can help consolidate readiness. Rituals are meaningful because they enact intention in a way the nervous system can recognize. If you feel called, you can perform a brief, optional declaration to mark your willingness. It can be spoken privately or shared publicly, depending on your comfort. One simple phrasing you might use aloud or write down is, "I recognize that I woke before broader change arrived. I commit to steady practice, to rest when needed, and to compassionate presence. I hold my boundaries and offer my steadiness without demanding others change. I am ready to cross this threshold." Say this in a quiet moment, or write it on a small card you keep in your wallet or journal. Repeat it when doubt arises. It is not a spell, it is a practice. Its power lies in the repetition and the clarity of intention it provides. If you choose to share this declaration publicly, frame it as optional and non-exclusive. Invite others to adapt the wording to their truth. The purpose is not to create a membership list, but to create a shared breath, an anchor for a community of practice. Treat any communal declarations as humble agreements rather than oaths of superiority. There are pragmatic rituals that support activation beyond words. Design a weekly rhythm that scaffolds your nervous system. 1 extended rest day, 2 movement sessions that restore rather than push, 3 brief check-ins where you assess alignment, and a monthly review where you notice patterns in your journal. These rhythms are not prescriptive. They are starting points you can shape to your life. The goal is to create enough continuity that when external pressure arrives, your baseline remains intact. As gatherings and invitations increase, your inner economy will be challenged by demands on attention. Practice a rule of proportionality. The larger the audience, the more you must insist on private replenishment. Visibility can deplete quickly. Replenish in proportion to exposure. This might look like a day off after a public workshop, a silent weekend after a week of intense meetings, or a brief period of solitude after launching a new initiative. Protecting your capacity is not selfish, it is stewardship. Teach with humility. When you offer tools to others, present them as tested experiments rather than ultimate truths. Invite feedback and revision. This models an ethic of fallibility that others can emulate, and it prevents the very perfectionism that undermines sustainable leadership. Watch for the emotional cost of constant attunement. Early stabilizers often carry the weight of scanning the atmosphere for dissonance. This attunement is a gift, but it can also lead to empathic overload. Regularly audit your limits. Use somatic practices to discharge what you pick up. Movement, breath work, grounding exercises, or a simple boundary ritual where you name an intention to release stray energies as you shower or change clothes. These tiny rituals are powerful because they teach your nervous system where you end and the world begins. As the network thickens, the quality of your collaborations will matter more than the quantity. Choose co-creators who share an ethic of humility, responsibility, and curiosity. Prefer long-term, small-scale projects to large, flashy ones that demand constant redefinition. Deep work that is sustainable tends to be quiet and iterative rather than spectacular and immediate. You will also need to cultivate patience with the pace at which others awaken. Not everyone will move at the tempo you might hope for. Meet this with a steady compassion. Resist labeling people as failed or stuck. Instead, consider them at different points on a long continuum. Your presence is a stabilizing signal. It may be received right away by some and only provide a seed for others. Both outcomes are meaningful. Keep cultivating secrecy about the parts of your practice that must remain private. Not every insight belongs in public discourse. There is a wise economy in withholding certain processes from broad scrutiny. Some practices are for personal maturation, and exposing them prematurely can dilute their effectiveness or create unhealthy dependencies. As you prepare for the threshold itself, the moment or series of moments when your readiness becomes externally manifest in a durable way, remember that thresholds are not solely achievement markers. They are invitations to greater responsibility and richer compassion. Crossing a threshold brings visibility, but visibility is an amplifier of your existing pattern. If your pattern is steadiness, your amplification will be serviceable. If it is reactivity, amplification will complicate things. Prepare your pattern, not your performance. When the threshold passes into a more visible phase, do not assume the work is finished. Activation is not the culmination. It is the beginning of sustained contribution. Your task shifts from personal integration to relational stabilization at scale. Continue your personal practices with the same fidelity as before. Let the private practices that anchored you be the ballast for public life. In the quieter moments, the times between projects, and the spaces often overlooked by ambition, give yourself permission to be ordinary. The sacredness of small rituals, the delight in an uninterrupted cup of tea, the honest conversation with a trusted friend. These are not distractions. They are the crucible in which sustainable transformation is forged. Pay attention to the mundane. It is where lasting change takes root. As you cross this larger threshold, there will be a new kind of reciprocity. You will find yourself both giving steadiness and receiving it in unexpected ways. Peers will show up to support initiatives, friends will offer practical help, and strangers will provide small kindnesses that remind you of the interconnectedness beneath the work. Accept help without apologizing. Reciprocity keeps you from becoming a martyr of service. It helps build infrastructure for the collective. In the weeks and months to come, keep a simple discipline. Once a week, list 3 things that felt like coherent choices that week and 1 thing you will attend to differently. This practice creates an ongoing feedback loop that preserves humility and promotes learning. Over time, the accumulation of these weekly entries becomes a map of your maturation. Finally, return to the central truth of why this message reached you. The universe, however you name that synchrony of timing, circumstance, and inner readiness, sent a note because you were awake before a larger shift. That timing was not arbitrary. Your early awakening is purposeful in the sense that it furnished the field with coherence at a moment when coherence would be needed. You are not a messiah. You are a keeper of steadiness. Your work is less about dramatic rescue and more about creating a habitual tone that others can sense and possibly emulate. If it helps, create a small ritual of closure for tonight. Light a candle if that feels right, sit for a few breaths, and say silently or aloud the commitment you want to carry into the threshold. It can be as simple as, I will practice steady presence. I will rest. I will choose kindness over justification. Keep the words short. Let them be a referencing chord you can return to in moments of doubt. Before we close, one gentle practice you can do now. Pause and bring to mind a concrete signal that told you were preparing long before the world caught up. A recurring dream, a sudden break, a song that landed at the exact right time, a friend who left or arrived. Hold that memory as a proof that you were already moving. Let it be evidence for the nervous system that you did not misread your own process. You were not early by mistake. You were timely by alignment. The message arrived to remind you of that alignment and to invite you into stewardship that is ethical, sustainable, and compassionately bounded. Walk forward with measured courage. Keep your rituals small and consistent, your boundaries clear, and your curiosity alive. If this message helped you see your path more clearly, consider doing one gentle thing. Write for a moment in your journal about one moment that showed you were already preparing. If you feel drawn, share a brief note here, or with someone who understands the subtle work. You never know which small confession will steady another person. Go forward with steadiness. The threshold is real and you are ready.